So at the London Trans Plus Pride Parade this weekend, a trans activist came on stage and called for women to be violently punched. Let's have a look at the clip.
I was going to come here and be really fluffy and be really nice and say, yeah, be really lovely and queer and gay. No, if you see a TERF, punch him in the fucking face.
So this man, he calls himself Sarah. He's actually an ex-con. He has been in prison for 30 years for kidnapping and attempted murder. And yet there he is, calling for violence against women, essentially, for women to be punched in the face. And everyone is cheering. Paul, make it make sense for me, please.
How can you make any of this stuff make sense? Look, I mean, I would describe myself as a near absolutist on free speech. But when it comes to things like inciting violence against people of that kind, I think it's off limits. I think actually if you get your collar felt because you've said that certain people should be physically attacked, in this case, you know, women, then I don't think you should have any complaints if PC Pod comes along and arrests you. And it seems to me that all of this, you know, people often say, politicians who just don't like these sorts of debates and want to try and please everybody, they say things like, you know, we need to take the heat out of the situation. All players need to take the heat out of the situation, almost like a play nicely children. And from what I can see, all of the kind of violence and unpleasantness comes from one side in the debate. I mean, I know lots of gender-critical feminists, as they're called, gender-critical. I don't know any of them who would dream of saying anything like that against any of their opponents. What they tend to do is to try to have, yes, they're passionate about their cause and they fight their corner, but they try to argue their case. They try to use the weight of argument. And it seems to me that all of the abuse and the harassment is coming from the other side. I don't see gender-critical feminists laying siege to people who are having a pro-trans meeting and trying to disrupt it and, you know, lobbing things at them and trying to shut them down and fight them and so on. And, you know, I think it's why so many of them get so angry at the unfairness of it. But look, this stuff is crazy. This stuff, people out there in mainstream Britain are looking at this sort of stuff and looking at the debate and looking at the position of some of our kind of political and cultural elites and listening to Keir Starmer say, you know, for 99% of women, it's biology, 99.9% of women, biology matters, but for 0.1%, almost as if you can set the rules of biology aside for 0.1% of women. You know, biology doesn't apply to you, where of course it does. And I do think as well, this is an example of what I would call overreach from the sort of radical trans movement, where a few years ago, I think before this debate kicked off a few years ago, I think the view of most people in this country is if someone was kind of trans and man and wanted to live their life as a woman, whatever that means, most people would probably say, okay, look, get on with it. I'm not that troubled by it. You know, do what you want, mate, as long as you're not kind of interfering with me. But as the demands became more and more extreme and more irrational, and it became about inserting yourself into women's sports and, you know, women's single-sex places and, you know, school children, their toilets and stuff like that. I think that's when most people kind of went, well, hold on a second, this wasn't the deal. You know, I mean, we were not expecting this. This is not what we signed up for. And that kind of overreach from the trans movement in terms of those demands has backfired in a massive way. And they're not going to win this campaign. I mean, when you look at the sort of ranks of women who are absolutely passionate about defending their own sex-based rights with good reason. I know some of these women, and they will not be defeated. You know, this debate in the end, I think this battle will only go one way. But people within the radical trans movement just don't know that yet. Yeah,
Tom, I mean, how does this sort of keep happening? Where there's, you know, trans activists who are either making violent threats, or you think back to the sort of what happened to Posey Parker in New Zealand a couple of months ago, essentially attacked by trans activists. What the hell is going on?
Well, it keeps happening, as you say. So there was the Posey Parker incident down under. She's also faced, and certainly her organisation and group have faced violence and threats from time to time before. I remember the first time that this issue really kind of got onto my radar in terms of how toxic it was getting was back in 2017 or 2018, I think, one of the early kind of gender critical meetings amongst the sort of the cohort that we know of now, was taking place, and they already had to meet in Hyde Park to then go to a secret venue because the venue they had previously had already been shut down. And there was a 60-year-old woman called Maria McLaughlin, I think, who was punched in the face by a 26-year-old male. And you thought, what the hell was going on here? Not least because it was not really front page news. People weren't really condemning it. There was even at the trial that eventually took place, the judge chided McLaughlin for not using the gentleman's chosen pronouns when that took place. And so these things keep happening, as we're talking about, not just in relation to physical violence, but also the threats, the things that didn't happen, the kinds of horrible things that ended up with Kathleen Stock having to leave the University of Sussex. Jo Phoenix, who was an Open University academic who was supposed to speak at Essex, she was no platform. There were flyers being circulated with pictures of a handgun and "shut the fuck up TERF" on it. And you think, show me one single example of Kelly J. Keane or Julie Bendel or Kathleen Stock or any of these other trans activists or even some hangers-on doing this. Show me an example of even some nutcase doing it and then those individuals I've just mentioned failing to condemn it. It's completely in one direction. And the thing about what happened at the Trans Pride Plus parade over the weekend, what was most shocking was the reaction to it. I mean, this particular individual, you know, as you say, has been in and out of prison, seems a pretty crazed individual in many respects. But at the same time, it was the fact that as soon as he'd made his little tirade, there was applause, there was cheering. The response from Sadiq Khan, the London mayor, was to reiterate his support for the LGBT plus etc. community. And then with a bit of kind of after the fact throat clearing about not liking violence, you had Clive Lewis from the Labour Party saying, essentially, all, you know, of course, calling for violence is wrong, but we'd be lying if we were saying it was going from one direction. And then the response from the Trans Plus Pride organisers, which was to say, of course we don't like violence, but Sarah was expressing her anger that many people feel, and they should be able to vent that. And you think, you're really morally lost if you're defending a male calling for, let's be clear about this, women to be punched in the face. That's what TERF means. It means a gender-critical woman, often of a certain age. That's the kind of caricature that they have in their heads. So how that isn't something that sparks condemnation, how that's something that's kind of just brushed under the carpet as people getting a bit carried away with themselves, particularly in an age in which we're encouraged to take offence at even the mildest slights, tells you something about how morally lost that particular movement is, but also how cowardly a lot of people who should know better are in the face of it. But I agree with Paul as far as I think that is starting to change, not least because of the bravery of these campaigners and these gender-critical individuals. But the fact that we ever got ourselves into this position in the first place, I think, is deeply troubling, really. And
I don't want to focus too much on this one individual, but it is interesting that their story is he says he cut his own balls off with a razor in prison and then claims to have eaten them because he didn't want someone to sew them back on. Now, you'd think that the trans movement would want to distance itself from these kind of obviously quite not very sane individuals, but because it is so dogmatic, because it says that anyone who says they are a woman is a woman, they can't distance themselves, can they? They're kind of stuck with these people.
And it seems to me that the same people who will often say to us, whether it's on COVID or climate change or whatever, follow the science. On this issue, they seem very happy to sort of put the science aside and say, it's not really about the science, you know, it's about people's feelings. And if that person feels that way, then actually that's how the rest of society should treat them. And I just don't think you should ever, as a society, find yourself in a position where you are elevating feelings over facts. And that's what we've done on this. And in any other, with any other kind of characteristic, whether it's your race, whether it's your nationality, whether it's your age or whatever, if somebody tried to claim they were something other than what they were, if I said I was 4'2" when I'm actually 6'1", you know, if you said you were, you know, Afro-Caribbean when obviously, you know, I don't think you are, Fraser.
No, yes. Best not to assume these days.
Then people would kind of look at you and say, well, hold on a second. Let's not be stupid about that. But when it comes to this, when it comes to a man saying, no, I am a woman, and you should treat me as such, some people back off and say, yeah, that's exactly how we should treat people, how we should treat these people. But actually, if you're a woman who kind of saw the whole concepts of womanhood being appropriated like that, And we don't do it for any other characteristic, but we say that actually women are fair game. We can appropriate, your biological sex and say that it's easy enough for anybody to be. And if you have got a problem with that, you're a bigot. That seems to me to be completely mental, frankly.
And it's also just reviving the most unvarnished kind of misogyny. I mean, if we talk about all the cases that we've been talking about, whether it's Kelly J. Keane in New Zealand or whether it's the various kind of women's rights or gender critical groups who have faced the most not only violent and threatening response, but often very explicitly misogynistic kind of response, sexualized, vile insults and so on, rape threats and such like, when you've got women who are trying to just do something as simple as to organise, to gather and to speak in public to defend their rights, and their response is, fuck off, you Nazis. You can't really put this down to anything other than a kind of woke misogyny which has been rehabilitated by this particular movement. And surely the image of an individual calling for women to be punched in the face and everyone cheering, if that's not going to be the point in which we will have to kind of take a step back and realise what has happened here, I don't really know what will, to be frank.